90% of our world is underwater, and some of that world is filled with remnants of mankind's past. A lot of these things have been down there for so long we honestly have no clue how they got down there, or even what they originally were. That doesn't mean they can't fascinate us, of course, but who knows when these mysteries will be solved. Here are 10 of the craziest man-made things we've discovered in our ocean. Under the shorelines of Yonaguni-jima, Japan are mysterious stone structures that thus far have no verifiable explanation. Some people think what's down there is man-made, while others feel it's simply a case of Mother Nature showing off. The Yonaguni Monument was discovered in 1986, and since then it has baffled experts as to what it actually is. There's a lot of stone down there, and if you look at it a certain way, it actually kind of looks like a city. That's what Masaki Kimura thinks anyway. He's a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus, and after 15 years of dives to the Yonaguni Monument, he's convinced that it's all man-made. He believes that the monument is actually the 5,000-year-old city of Mu, a mythological sunken city that's essentially the Japanese Atlantis. He bases his opinion on certain structures that to him and some other observers look like various human buildings. He has seen a castle, temples, roads, walls, a pyramid, and even a stadium, not to mention rocks that look like kings and reliefs that look like cows. But Kimura's observations are far from proven facts. Many people feel he's simply seeing what he wants to see, and that the underwater stone structures are literally just that, stone. Boston University professor Robert Schnock believes that every shape has a scientific and geological explanation, such as tectonic movement, scouring eddies, and holes formed by undersea critters burrowing around looking for a home. What's more, Japan's Agency for Cultural Affairs refuses to dub the Yonaguni Monument as anything important, and the Okinawa Prefecture agrees. You might not normally think of computers as being over 2,200 years old, but the Antikythera mechanism might make you reconsider. This fascinating structure, most likely created either by ancient Greece or Babylonia, was discovered inside the wreck of the Antikythera in 1900. For the longest time, experts had no idea what to make of it. It looked positively futuristic, with its triangular gears and evenly divided rings. It came across as a clock or a calendar, or perhaps even a computer. But computers didn't exist back then, as far as we know. So what gives? It wasn't until the device was placed under X-rays in the 1970s and then again in the 1990s that the truth began to come out. As far as science is concerned, the Antikythera mechanism was a machine that replicated the movement of the planets and sun. This was backed up further in 2006, when scientists at Cardiff University in Wales conducted CT scans of the mechanism. According to their findings, there were additional parts to this machine, which were either still underwater or gone forever, that were essentially colored balls. Each ball represented a different celestial being, such as a red one for Mars, an orange one for the Sun, and a blue one for our humble little Earth. Because certain parts to this machine are gone, it's still unknown how the planet balls move. Some experts feel they move with the help of gears, but others feel even the ancient geniuses behind this crazy machine couldn't have pulled off such a feat. But nobody really has any other ideas right now, unless you consider the theory of fringe writer Eric von Daniken. He thinks the mechanism came from aliens. Sounds legit. I know, it's not exactly crazy to find a sunken ship at the bottom of the ocean, but the Titanic is the sunken ship, and the story of its discovery is far more fascinating than any movie James Cameron could put together. As most people know, the Titanic sunk in April of 1912, but incredibly, nobody could find the thing for decades afterward. Finally, on September 1st, 1985, a team of researchers led by ex-Navy Captain Robert Ballard found the ship's bow, along with a trail of debris leading to the wreckage. The tragic ship had sunk over 12,500 feet below the surface. Since then, it apparently becomes humanity's mission to extract as much of the ship from the ocean as possible. Between 1986 and 2004, a company called RMS Titanic visited the Titanic to collect what they could from her. They ultimately claimed over 5,500 pieces of fancy debris, such as fine china, leather trunks, kitchen utensils, and undoubtedly the biggest haul of all, the ship's hull. In 1998, RMS Titanic divers managed to bring a 17-ton part of the ship's hull up to land. And they did exactly what you might expect them to do. They took that historic chunk of metal on tour. The problem is, as cool as it may be to see the actual Titanic up close, exposure to all this oxygen after all those years of rust and corrosion may actually wind up destroying the ship within 50 years. And you thought the iceberg was bad news. Finding what might be an underwater burial ground is amazing enough on its own, but if a person buried there might well be a disciple of Jesus, well, that just makes things 100 times more interesting. That's what some people think is the story behind a 2,500-year-old settlement found in Lake Issyk-Kul, over 75 feet below the surface of Kyrgyzstan. The settlement is littered with artifacts, over 200 of which have since been brought to land. There were ceramic jars, knife-sharpening stones, pieces of slag, and even a bronze sickle. While no one knows for sure what this place was, one prevailing theory is that this was an Armenian monastery from from way back in the day. Simply finding what might be an ancient monastery deep underwater would be pretty cool, but the Orthodox Church believes people were buried there, not just monks either. One theory is that St. Matthew, one of Christ's 12 disciples, was laid to rest here. Is it true? That's hard to say, since bodies typically don't leave evidence after 2,500 years in water, but it could be true. After all, everyone's got to be buried somewhere. It sounds like a horror movie. A deep cavern inside a sinkhole is discovered to contain countless human remains, including elongated skulls that could have been subject to who knows what kind of torture. But it's very real, and whatever happened to cause this scene terrifies very real people to this very day. An ancient Mayan city called Mayapan went underwater hundreds of years ago, and the locals on the surface above have been afraid to go anywhere near the site. According to legend, a monstrous serpent with a horse's head guards the place and eats whoever approaches. A team led by archaeologist Bradley Russell decided they didn't much believe that myth, and decided to go diving down to Mayapan to see what was down there. As it turns out, there was no horse serpent, but what they did find was almost as horrifying. Inside the cavern's chambers were human bones littered everywhere. Worse, they found well over a dozen human skulls inside, all of which were disturbingly elongated. How this happened, nobody knows for certain. In some cases, infants of that era had their skulls flattened on purpose, for reasons only known to the people doing the flattening. Others, however, don't appear to have been flattened on purpose, meaning something very bad happened to them most likely. Since the skulls appeared to belong to men, women, and children alike, it likely wasn't a sacrifice. One possibility bandied about that these were plague victims, buried far away from the mainland so their corpses can't infect the living. This, of course, doesn't explain the flat, elongated skulls. Maybe that was a gruesome symptom of whatever disease they dealt with. Over the centuries, we've learned tons about how the ancient Romans lived, but amazingly, we had to go underwater to find out how they kept themselves healthy. Over 2,000 years ago, a Roman ship called the Relito de Poncino sank around Tuscany, and there it stayed until the 1980s, when divers discovered it and quickly began collecting its treasure. There were the typical finds, like lamps, bowls, and jugs, but the most fascinating find was a medicine chest. Inside were well over 100 wooden drug vials, but also several sealed tin ones, with surviving medications still inside. Thanks to the expert sealing, the pills inside the vials were both dry and intact. This provided a huge opportunity to learn how our Roman ancestors overcame their sick days. As it turns out, their pills were quite complex. Inside were such ingredients as iron, zinc, starch, beeswax, and pine resin, among other materials derived from nature and not the chemistry lab. Scientists believe these pills were for treating eye infections, though it's unknown whether they actually worked. Best stick to Visine just in case. You've heard of the Great Train Robbery. Now get ready for the Great Train Mystery. In 1985, an oceanographer named Paul Hepler was mapping out the ocean floor when his devices picked up some strange objects. Upon further investigation, he discovered that the objects were two sunken locomotives, but he didn't really bother looking into them too much. So it wasn't until 2003 that archaeologists stumbled upon them again and attempted to unravel their mysteries. So far, they've been largely unsuccessful. What is known? Two trains from the 1850s are underwater, some 90 feet below the surface. What isn't known? Much else. There are no records of these trains being built, nor of their loss. That might be because they weighed 15 tons, whereas most trains of the time weighed upwards of 35 tons. So it's possible that the designers, realizing they had just built the equivalent of a flip phone when everyone around them had an iPhone XS, didn't bother to tell anyone about them. As for what happened to them, we don't know that for sure either. The belief is that they were being transported by ship. A gnarly storm hit and workers pushed the obsolete trains overboard to ensure their ship didn't go down as well. But there's no way to know that for sure, what with the lack of records. Even more curious is how well preserved these trains are. They've been underwater for 160 years and are caked in layers of rust, but still look very much like trains. Perhaps one day scientists will attempt to surface these antiques and clean them up for sightseeing purposes. Of course, by doing so, we would risk the train suffering the same crumbling fate as the Titanic, so perhaps it's best to let sleeping trains lie. Everyone talks about Atlantis, but no one's actually seen the mythical city. However, a real-life Atlantis does exist, and it's somehow been preserved so well the only thing stopping us from moving there is the whole lack of oxygen thing. We call the 5,000-year-old sunken city Pavlopetri, though what the ancients called it is still a mystery. You can find it to the south of Greece, but you'll have to dive down 4 meters or about 13 feet to find it. It's completely submerged, and has been so for roughly 3,000 years. Scientists believe that around 1000 BC, earthquakes caused the land underneath Pavlopetri to sink, taking the city with it. Incredibly, despite the thousands of years that the water has had to corrode the city, scientists are amazed by just how pristine Pavlopetri is. You can still see exactly how the city was designed and arranged, with roads, temples, cemeteries, water channels, and even a town plaza immediately identifiable. Thus far, over 15 buildings have been uncovered, and many contain a dozen or more rooms inside. Whoever designed this city clearly had both money and knowledge of how to make this stuff last. To many, the ancient holy city of Dvaraka is nothing more than a myth, but recent discoveries have suggested that the lost land was real, or at least based on a reasonable facsimile thereof. According to Hindu legend, Vishnu's eighth avatar Krishna was forced out of his hometown after over a dozen attacks from their enemies, the neighboring kingdom of Magadha. He made his way northwest, and there he founded Dvaraka after pleasing the Lord of the Sea with proper worship. He lived there until his death, at which time the city sunk under the power of a massive flood. After all, if the holy man who was the reason the gods allowed the city to be built was gone, what reason did they have to keep the place afloat? There are those who believe Dvaraka was more than just a religious story, and now they may have proof. Archaeologists have conducted several digs over the years, all around the Dwarkadish temple that's essentially the centerpiece of the modern city Dwarka. By doing so, they've discovered several stone structures such as anchors, construction blocks, and barrier walls, most of which date as far back as 3,500 years ago. Some of these objects were found directly under the temple, while others were found offshore. Either way, this suggests to many that either Krishna actually did build an extravagant holy city through the power of prayer, or a separate ancient city existed that was extravagant enough to inspire such a story. You don't need to wait until the next Star Wars movie to see the Millennium Falcon again. All you need to do is dive 90 meters, or about 300 feet, down the Baltic Sea, and see the bizarre anomaly that looks just like Han Solo's vessel. Known appropriately enough as the Baltic Sea Anomaly, this strange 200-foot wide, 26-foot tall structure was discovered in June 2011 by the Ocean X team, led by Peter Lindbergh. Years later, neither Ocean X nor anyone else knows all that much about the anomaly, except that it's been dated as super old. Estimates place the structure as being well over 140,000 years old. Everything else is just so many theories. Some people think it's an ancient weapon, while others think it might actually be a UFO. Other less imaginative experts feel it's nothing more than an oddly shaped glacier. Lindbergh and his team don't know what it is either, but they don't agree on it being a regular old rock or glacier. According to Lindbergh, whenever they got near the anomaly, all their electrical equipment would short out and wouldn't work again until they swam at least 200 meters away. So they believe it's a huge metallic structure, but they couldn't begin to explain what kind of metallic structure. For the time being, it appears